Now that we've created a form, it's time to actually get it to do something. So we're going to start with submission failure. Like what happens if you submit invalid data? Remember, we've got validations on our user model here. So if we submit this form, say, with no name or with an invalid email address, so presence is true, we want the email address to have the right format, and so on, then there should be some sort of error messages displayed. That's what we're going to do in this section, and then we'll get it working in the next section. Before we do that, though, I don't know about you, but when I see something like this, I can't resist temptation. Like there's a form on a page with a button. So let's see what happens if you click on it. Yeah, so somewhat disappointing. What happened here, of course, is that we're trying to post to the create action. Remember, we've got these routes. In the routes file, because of the resources users line, there is a route for post to the users URL /users. We saw this before in the context of the demo app. If you post to /users, it gets routed to the create action. But of course, there is no such action right now. As you might be able to guess, in this section, we're going to have to add one. Now, you may recall from the demo app that when we submitted an invalid set of data to the scaffolded form, we got this nice set of error messages. And so here's a mock-up of what that looked like and what we want it to look like in our sample application. So you can see that on an invalid submission, there should be a little area here that says the things that are wrong with the submission. In order to get started with a failing form, let's actually put in a create action. And for now, let's just render new. And actually, I think let's copy this too. We're going to need an @user to render the new page. This is just a stub to see what happens if you submit this form. So let's go take a look at this. Let's reload this. Should be the same. And now I'm going to click on sign up. Okay, take a look at what happened there. We just submitted the form. And remember, we put this debug information down at the bottom. And under user, this, which is a hash, this is the params hash, there are attributes corresponding to the different things we submitted. So there's name blank, email blank, password blank, and password confirmation blank. And actually, by blank, I mean, in this case, the empty string. And so if you put in name, if I put in foobar, this is actually valid submission, but not now. So you can see here that the user submission has a name, Michael Hartle, email, michael@example.com, and so on. If you look at the source code, that's what this does here, this user of name. This is a label, or I mean, it's literally a name. Here's the name, user email. That Rails interprets as a nested hash. So the params hash, as we'll see later in this lesson, has a key user, and that key corresponds to another hash of values or key value pairs, name with a name, email with the email address, and so on. And so as we proceed with this failing case for a sign-up form, we're going to need to simulate this sort of submission inside of our test. There's something else that I want to draw your attention to, which is that the URL up here is /users. Remember, we posted to the /users URL and then rendered the new page. So that's why it's not at /user/new or at /signup. But let's go back to the signup page. And I'm just going to comment this stuff out here for now. And now let's take a look at the users controller spec and think about how we're going to test for a failing user creation form. So we've got describe get new here. We've also got up here describe get show. So that suggests down here saying describe post create. Since the HTTP request is a post and it's going to the create action. And I'm actually going to get rid of this in here because we're going to make one more nested block here. And we're going to say describe failure. And in here, we're going to have to put in some tests. for the kind of behavior we expect when we submit a form with invalid data. So we should think about how we're going to do that. You can probably guess that we're going to post some sort of user information, and that information should correspond to an invalid user. So let's start with the before each block that defines an attributes hash corresponding to invalid user data. So it's certainly invalid if everything is the empty string. And now I'm going to say that when we post to the create action with these user attributes, that it should have the right behavior. In particular, I want it to have the right title, which is just sign up. We should revert back to the same title that we had on the sign up page. And we should also render the new page, as we saw in this example that I've commented out right here. So let's say it should have the right title. I'm going to make this a pending spec for now. Now, this alias won't work in default TextMate. I wrote this for myself. It's a pending spec, but you can just get rid of the do end if you want. So it should render the new page. And then I want to test that, in fact, this does not create a user because it's a failing post. We should not create a user. It should not create a user. Let's save this. So we've got our 3 pending examples. And let's think about how we're going to get this to work. So let's say it should have the right title, do. And this is how you post to the create action. You might be able to guess from get new and from up here, get show, that we're going to post to the create action. And just as up here we did ID is success. Remember, this is what mapped to params of ID. Let's take a look at this. Remember, we did user.find params of ID. We're going to be using params of user. Remember from this submission. Yeah, we are red here. Oh, that's right. I commented it out. Let me just uncomment it. Perhaps that was unwise. I just reloaded there. Resend it. Right. So down here we see that. Remember, this is YAML for, this is like a YAML format for a hash. This is the key. So instead of params of ID, it's going to be params of user. So what that means is that in here, we should pass a hash with key user and then value equal to the attributes that are invalid. And let's take a look at what this does. What should the response do? Well, response should have selector, title, and the content should be the same as on the sign up page, so sign up. And let's see if we can write 2 tests at the same time here. Post create. And response dot should, and this is new, we haven't seen this yet, should render template. And then we tell it which template it's going to render. So this is, in this context, it's just the view should render template new. Let's save that. Actually, let's lose focus. Well, we can save them both. So we should be red. Good. Those 2 examples that we just added are both invalid. But now if we do render new, we can get one of them to pass with this. This now renders the right page, so we should be, oh, that's kind of surprising. Take a look at this. Yeah, so the problem here is that the entire form is just breaking because it says undefined method model name for nil class. We do need to create a user of some kind. So let's uncomment this line. Okay, so we don't have the right title yet. So let's put in the right title. So that's good. Now we're yellow because we've got one more pending spec. And now we need to test for it should not create a user. So let's say do. Now this is a little tricky. What we want is to post to the create action with invalid user attributes and have it not create a user in the database. And the way we're going to do this is with what's called a lambda block. So lambda is a word that it's just a Greek letter that comes from an area of theoretical computer science called the lambda calculus, and it's used in lots of contexts in programming. So I don't really have a better explanation for it than that, but it's a way of making what's called an anonymous block. It's just a block that doesn't do anything. All it does is contain some code, and the only way to understand it, I think, is just to see some examples. So let's take a look at this. We do lambda do, and then we have an end keyword, and then inside we're going to say post create user attributes, and then inside of this this block, now we've tried to create a user, and now we're going to say that this block itself, we're going to call a method on the block. This is a little bit weird, but we're going to call a method. We're going to do .should not change the user count. So this is change user count. So let's take a look at what's going on here. Let's just open up a console. Actually, it says master branch, but it's really not. I just hadn't hit return on the sign up branch. So let's just do Rails console in the sandbox. So the count method is just a way of counting the number of users in the database. So user.count just tells us how many users are in the database. In this case, there are none. And so what this lambda block says is that if you post to the create action with invalid user attributes, it should not change the user count. So change is just a method that comes with our spec, and this syntax in here it takes a symbol as the second argument, and what it does is it calls the method corresponding to that symbol on this first argument, which in this case is the user model. So this is a little bit complicated, but we're going to see several more examples, and I think once you've seen 3 or 4 examples, it'll start to sink in. So notice we are green right now, but we want to be even greener. In this user.new, remember, we can initialize a user with a hash, and so in the console session in lesson 4, we saw that params of user in this context is, in fact, exactly the kind of initialization hash we need. So I'm going to save this, and it should still be green. In other words, this should not actually create a new user. Good. In fact, we can even try saving it. So now we're doing all the things that we would do if we were trying to actually save this user to the database, and we're still green because it's not creating a user in this context. And the reason it's not creating the user is because the data does not pass the validations. Remember, when we do @user.save in this context, if params of user is invalid, then it won't actually save the user because it fails the validations. Now, it might be a little bit abstract at this point to see what this params of user is. So this is a nice technique that I like. It's a very heavy-handed technique, but oftentimes when debugging, I find it useful. So I'm going to show you how to do this. This is raise. I just want to see what params of user looks like. And I'm going to raise params of user dot inspect. Remember, the inspect method from lesson 4 shows a nice string representation of the object. So let's do this. We'll be red after this. That's fine. So I'm going to click sign up here. And so these are the values that we submitted. Now, inside of this web page, Rails is actually using strings as keys, but symbols work as well, and that's the sort of the standard way we think about these things, as being symbols. But if you look at this, these are just the key value pairs corresponding to the information we just submitted. And if you look down at here under request parameters, this is the params hash, and you can see that params of user is exactly this hash that we've just looked at up here. You'll also notice that we're anticipating some later material that doesn't show the passwords. They're filtered. That's kind of nice. By the way, it also shows this crazy thing. I don't know if this is going to be in all versions of Rails. It shows this snowman. This must be some sort of it's a little snowman. It's crazy. Let's take a look at what's generating that. Look at that. There's a hidden field snowman, and it's just there's an HTML entity that's the snowman. That's crazy. Okay, so that's a little bit nutty, but we can see that things are basically working the way we expect them to. So I'm going to get rid of this, and we'll be back to green. And now we're going to get this form to work for real. And we are most of the way there right now. In fact, if you remember our if-else branching structure, we can refactor this just a little bit and say if at user.save, then handle the save. So this is just a comment to stub it out for now. Else, we're going to put in the right title and then render the new page. So if I save this, it ought to still be green. Let's see if it is. There we go. Look at that. And so at this point in this next section, all we need to do is figure out what to do in this little part of the branch here. But before we move on to that, we're going to add some code to handle the presence of errors. Remember in our mockup that we wanted to show some errors when the form submission is invalid, like here. So let's get that to work. So to see how this is going to work, let's go back to our console and see what happens if we try to save a user that it has invalid information. So let's say user is equal to user.new. Actually, let's just do user.new. This is pretty short. And let's just save it. False, good, because the validations catch that. And now let's look at the error messages. User.errors, there's an errors object that gets created automatically when you try to save this user. And then there's an object called full messages. And as you'll see, it's just an array of strings. It's an array of the error messages that you get from trying to save this thing. So in this case, name can't be blank, email can't be blank, email is invalid, password can't be blank, password is too short. So what we want on the sign-up page is some sort of error box that has these strings indicating what went wrong with a submission. So let's see how that works. This used to be handled by some magical code in earlier versions of Rails, but as of Rails 3, the framework expects us to handle it on our own. So we'll define an error messages partial in order to render these errors. And now we're going to go into the actual new page. Let's take a look at it. New.html.erb. And up here, actually just inside the form for, we're going to render a partial. So let's do this. Let's do render shared / error messages _ messages. And you'll note I'm not writing a test for this. I don't usually write tests for HTML structure like this. We will handle this later on with an integration test. So let's do render shared error messages. And what we need to do here is create a new folder called shared. I use a shared folder for partials that are used on multiple views. And so we'll see that later on in this tutorial, we'll be rendering the error messages for a micropost creation as well. So we're anticipating a little later material here. But this is the sort of thing that, with experience, you'll be able to see that this is the kind of thing you'll want to have on multiple pages. So inside of this folder, we need to create an error messages partial. Remember, partials start with an underscore, a leading underscore error messages .html.erb. So it used to be we were able to punt on this complexity when learning Rails for the first time, but the people who make Rails decided that it was too inflexible to use the magical line that you can look up in among other places, the Ruby on Rails 2.3 tutorial book. But as of Rails 3, we need to do it ourselves, so I'm just going to put this code in. Actually, let's go to the console. I'm going to show you how to build this up. We're going to need a couple of new ideas. First of all, we're going to use a method called any, which is essentially the opposite of empty. So let's make an array. Now this array is not empty, so array.empty question mark is false. Anytime empty is false for an array, any is true. Any essentially means any elements. So we're about to use that. Remember that we had user.errors. This is how we got out the full error messages. See what we did here. Yeah, full messages. So what we're going to say is user.errors.any. So that's true because there are errors. The second thing we want to do is we want to say how many errors there are. And when you talk about how many errors there are, if there's only one error, then you want to say one error. If there are two errors, you want to say two errors, and so on for higher numbers. And Rails has a nice method called pluralize to handle this case. Unfortunately, it's not included by default in the console, but we can include it explicitly as follows. So here we go. We include action view helpers text helper. And the way you can find this is to look in the Rails API and try to find the pluralize function. So pluralize. So let's pluralize with the number 1 and say error. And it says 1 error. And pluralize, let's say 17 errors. So this pluralize function uses what's called an inflector to change the pluralization of its second argument. And it's pretty smart, actually. If you do like 1 goose, it knows that it's only 1 goose, but if it's 17, oh man, it doesn't know that one. That's awful. What about sheep? So it looks like the inflector isn't perfect. I'm surprised it doesn't know goose. Okay, it knows that the plural of sheep is sheep. What's another good? How about woman? Oops. So let's take a look at 17. Okay, it doesn't know how to pluralize woman. So it knows it's 17 women, but it doesn't know that it's 17 geese. That's too bad. But anyway, it actually knows quite a few irregular ones. Maybe by the time you're using this, they will have fixed the gooses. Someone will watch this tutorial and realize they need to change the pluralize. Okay, so let's take a look at how to build up this error area, this like error box. So I'm going to put some embedded Ruby in here. And now, before we've done %equals in almost every case, because the %equals version of embedded Ruby inserts the actual code at that point in the template. But we saw it down here with the end that we don't have the %equals for the end. If you don't want to insert it, then you just do % with no equals. So open left angle bracket, %, close angle bracket. So let's do this. If, we can just put a conditional in here, at user.errors.any, then we're going to handle it. And then let's put an end. So now we want to put out some sort of error explanation. And there's a standard set of IDs and classes that happen in this case. And so this is just based on my prior experience using this sort of error message. I'm going to put in a div with class error underscore explanation. Sorry, ID error underscore explanation. ID. And now I'm going to put in an H2, second level heading, with the error count. So let's just do pluralize. Even though I had to load it explicitly in the console, it's loaded automatically inside the view. Pluralize at user.errors.count. So this is how many errors there are. And then I'm going to pluralize the word error. Then I'm going to say, so this number of errors, so 1 error or 2 errors, prohibited this user from being saved. And then I'm going to have a colon. And now notice we've used the word user here. We'll see later on in the tutorial how to make this refer to whatever the parent object is. But for now, it's just going to be user. Later on, we'll have to make it so that it can handle a micropost as well. And now I'm going to have a paragraph. problems with the following fields. And now I'm going to use the each method to iterate through the @users.errors.full messages array. So remember we saw this here, this guy here. In fact, let's just copy it. I'm going to iterate through it using embedded Ruby. So let's paste it in. We need to make it an @user. @user.errors.fullMessages.each do, and let's just have a message. This takes a one variable in this block, so message. And now I'm going to put in an li. Oh, I forgot the ul. So we actually want a ul here. This is an unordered list of errors, and now I'm going to put in an li. And let's just put in the message. And we need an end here. Actually, let's leave off the end and see what happens. I want you to see the error message here. Okay, so we can see that there's a syntax error on line 15 of error messages.html.erb. So this is the kind of thing that can go wrong, and oftentimes the syntax error will just happen at the end of the file, so you have to guess where it is, and you have to look through and see that we're missing an end here. Let's see if this worked. And look at that, we actually got it working. There were two, so right here I've got Michael Hartle and mhartle@example.edu. These are valid name and email values, but I left the password and password confirmation blank. So there's an error here. Notice the password does match the confirmation. Like if I put in something here and put something else here, we'll get the proper error. Password doesn't match confirmation. Now in the error messages partial, I used a new method that you may not even have noticed because it's so natural. We use pluralize @user.errors.count. So let's take a look at how that works. So here's our user.errors. And now we can do user.errors.count. And this just returns the total number of errors. And what this does is it pluralizes the word error properly based on the count. By the way, this is not the same thing as length. If you look at length, this is 3 because there are 3 key value pairs. But count actually counts up all of the different errors. Now at this point, this form is basically working, and we can even take a look and see mhartle@.edu. Let's just do another error. You can see that now there are 2 errors that prohibited the form from being saved. So everything is working, but it doesn't look quite as nice as it could. So let's put in some custom CSS for this error section. Now there's quite a lot of CSS here, so I'm just going to copy from the Ruby on Rails tutorial book. So let's go into our custom.css. I'm just going to paste it in here. And you may have noticed in the book I use these vertical dots to indicate omitted text. In this case, though, you do need to delete them. CSS won't complain too loudly. With Ruby, it'll be a syntax error, but here it'll just mysteriously not work. So this is for the error messages. So there's quite a bit going on here. The names of these classes and IDs are based on the old magical line that Rails used to have. So this is more or less backwards compatible with earlier versions of Rails. That's not particularly important. What's important right now is that this will actually give us a nicer error messages area. So you can see there, 2 errors prohibited this user from being saved. And so now it's formatted more nicely, and it's got highlighted text boxes for that actually draw the user's attention to the places where the errors are. So at this point, we do have a working form with working error messages, and there's only one more thing that I want to take a look at before moving on, and that's an issue related to passwords in the log, the server log. So let's take a look at a TextMate, and I want to go into the user's controller, and inside create, let's raise params.inspect, and let's just submit this. It's actually better. Let's look at params of user.inspect. This would be nicer. Let's just resend this. And so you can see here that the password and password confirmation actually do show up in the params, but they don't show up when the parameters are listed here under the request object. So look at this, password filtered, password confirmation filtered. And this is new in Rails 3. It used to be that you had to do this by hand, but as of Rails 3, any field called password in any model is automatically filtered. So let's take a look at the log. And actually, let's get rid of this here. Let's get rid of this and go back here, do a submission. So let's take a look at our server log. Here's the server log. Right here, we've got our snowman again. This is the parameters from the post user. So you can say started post/users, processing by users controller create as HTML, and here are the parameters. And we've got user name with the name, email, and then password filtered, password confirmation filtered. And the reason this is good, we went to all this trouble in the last lesson to use these really nice, strong, encrypted passwords. Like, how awful would it be if we just logged all the passwords, and so that anybody who got their hands on this server log could have the passwords for almost everyone on the site? So, I mean, potentially everyone if we didn't cycle our logs or rotate our logs. So let's take a look at how that works very briefly. This is actually in a file called application.rb in the config directory. So let's look at config application.rb. You don't really have to know about this, but I just want to show you that there is this line, config.filterParameters plus equals password. So plus equals is a way of adding something to an array. So this is an array of the things you need to filter, and so it adds this password to filter parameters. So you notice it just assumes that the Rails framework assumes that you're going to use the word password to indicate a password. But if you wanted to use something else, like suppose you wanted people to submit some sort of secret code, you could add this here. Now, if you were to make a form with a secret code field instead of password, if you also added a secret code, it would also be filtered from the log in exactly the same way. So at this stage in your Rails programming, you don't have to worry too much about security because Rails handles a lot of things automatically for you. But because security problems are big problems, I wanted to emphasize something, even though you're probably not going to run into it for a while.